Hi, David Mould here. Let me confess to you that I've had to come back into the studio to split this update into two parts. 90 plus minutes of chatter is just too long for most people. Hopefully you've seen part one, which we've titled San Antonio, What Elder Wilson Didn't Say. Welcome to part two. Here we're going to look a bit at a man who inspires me, Winston Churchill, or more properly, Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. If I were to draw a contrast between Elder Wilson and the man whom many consider the most famous Englishman of all time, you could perhaps boil it down to the following sentence. One saw no peace. The other, apparently, sees no war. Before we get into it, let's wrap up our comments on Elder Wilson's sermon. Let's go back now to where we left off in part one. It's good to know about your grandfather's Bible, Brother Ted, and your father's Bible, and your penchant for losing Bibles. It's good to know about all of that. But wouldn't it have been more appropriate, considering the time in which we live, to have spent some time telling us what those Bibles have to say about the Antichrist? With the Pope headed for Congress in September, wouldn't it have been even a teeny-weeny bit appropriate to remind us what God's servant, whom we're now told is no longer authoritative in the Seventh-day Adventist Church? I said, wouldn't it have been even a teeny-weeny bit appropriate to remind us what God's servant had to say about arousing the masses to resist the advances of the papacy? Couldn't we even have heard from you in your sermon a word about that? I grant you, you spoke about unity as being the ideal for the church. But what you didn't amplify was this balancing statement from the great controversy. Speaking of the early church, the servant of the Lord said this, quote, to secure peace and unity, they were ready to make any concession consistent with fidelity to God. But they felt that even peace would be too dearly purchased at the sacrifice of principle. If unity could be secured only by the compromise of truth and righteousness, then let there be difference and even war. Well would it be for the church and the world if the principles that actuated those steadfast souls were revived in the hearts of God's professed people. There is an alarming indifference in regard to the doctrines which are the pillars of the Christian faith. The opinion is gaining ground that, after all, these are not of vital importance. This degeneracy is strengthening the hands of the agents of Satan, so that false theories and fatal delusions, which the faithful in ages past imperiled their lives to resist and expose, are now regarded with favor by thousands who claim to be followers of Christ. That's great controversy, pages 45 and 46. To you, my audience today, did you get what Mrs. White is saying? Number one, it would be good for the church, that's us today, and the world, if the principles that actuated those steadfast souls, the early church, Ephesus, it would be good if those principles were revived in the hearts of God's professed people. And the key principle she speaks about is a refusal to come together in unity if it means we have to compromise our faith. Two, it is the indifference regarding doctrines that are the pillars of the church that have paved the way for the foolishness of things like spiritual formation to flourish. Now let me tell you something. I'm going to touch a subject here. As for the colors of the gay flag that were all over the place in San Antonio, we got the following comment at YouTube. Quote, have you seen our new homosexual flag all over San Antonio streets? God have mercy. We went too far. The wrath of God will follow. We went too far. Just for those of you who don't know, here are a few screen grabs of the gay pride flag and colors. You take a look and compare it with what you saw in San Antonio. My friend, If it was all over the streets in San Antonio, as this person says, I wouldn't know because I wasn't there. But it was all over the television screens too, as Elder Wilson spoke. Here he is in living color as he gave us his message of peace. How did Jeremiah put it? Quote, they have healed also the hurt of the daughter of my people slightly, saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. Were they ashamed when they had committed abomination? Nay, they were not at all ashamed, neither could they blush. Therefore they shall fall among them that fall. At the time that I visit them, they shall be cast down, saith the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways, and see, and ask for what? The old path. Where is the good way? And walk therein, and you shall find rest for your souls. But they said, we will not walk therein. That's Jeremiah 6, 14 to 16. If we stayed with the old path, if, among other things, we reminded the church not only about the heavenly sanctuary, which you did, Brother Ted, but about the identity and wickedness of the Antichrist, there would be more power in the church and less room for foolishness like the homosexual agenda and women's ordination to creep in. Recently, we got an article written by a professor at one of our universities. He sent it to me personally, and he gave me permission to use it as I saw fit. I'm not going to quote the whole article here, but I will point out 3 verses that he shared. First are Isaiah chapter 3, verses 8, 9, and 12. For Jerusalem is ruined, and Judah is fallen, because their tongue and their doings are against the Lord, to provoke the eyes of his glory. The show of their countenances doth witness against them, and they declare their sin as Sodom. They hide it not. Woe unto their soul, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves. As for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, they which lead thee cause thee to err, and destroy the way of thy path. That's Isaiah 3, 8, 9, and 12. He then said this. Notice that in the above text, Isaiah is referring to Jerusalem and Judah, that is God's people. He says that God's people proclaim the sin of Sodom and do not hide it. Then he indicates that a result of God's people disobeying him would be that women would rule over them, and their children would become their oppressors. The text also states that it would be the church leaders who would be foremost in promoting error. I think this is a fitting place to begin coming to a close. Before I do though, let me tell you a story. Not 48 hours ago, I was visiting with somebody who told us that her sister not only wants nothing to do with any conference church, but condemns those who do. She went on to say that she, that is her sister, is addicted to a particular independent ministry that sees absolutely no good in the conference churches. What I found particularly interesting as she spoke to me is that the ministry she identified is one of those that I strongly believe is a Davidian ministry. That was the ministry that I had in mind when I spoke about ministries that won't go outside the church to win one soul to Christ. That's a telltale sign that you're sending your support to people who have a different agenda. If they won't go outside the church to win, but see it as their duty to stay in the church and to draw people onto their doctrine, I'm telling you, that's a telltale sign you're in trouble. No, I can't identify this ministry, the ministry she mentioned, because I have no proof of their affiliation with the Davidians. What I would like to point out here, though, is that though I direct my tithe to lay people doing the work of God, and I've done so for over 20 years, I'm a member of a conference church and have no intention of leaving it until or unless I am pushed out. In short, I have faith in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In spite of what we're going through now, even in spite of our videos, I have faith that though it might look like it is about to fall, it will not fall. Here is a statement from the pen of inspiration on which I bank my faith. Quote, The church may appear as about to fall, but it does not fall. It remains, while the sinners in Zion will be sifted out, the chaff separated from the precious wheat. This is a terrible ordeal, but nevertheless, it must take place. That's prophecy coming from the pen of Ellen White, Selected Messages, Book 2, page 380. Now, as for me, why can't I just calm down and come into the fold in peace? I've already told you, I'm in the fold. I'm a member of the church. All right, let me put that question a little bit more bluntly. Why can't I stop barking and just shut up? First, as I've said repeatedly, I've read a little too much history. Men like Winston Churchill inspire me.
Now we are the masters of our fate. That the task which has been set us is not above our strength. That its pangs and toils are not beyond our endurance. As long as we have faith in our cause and an unconquerable willpower, salvation will not be denied us. In the words of the psalmist, he shall not be afraid of evil tidings. His heart is fixed, trusting in the Lord.
Remember that lady JSL at the top of this sermon who was encouraging me to hold on? Remember her invoking the name of Winston Churchill? I didn't share the quote she selected then, but here it is now. Never give in, is what she's saying, Brother Mould. Never give in. Never, 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 never in nothing great or small, large or petty. Never give in, except to convictions of honor and good sense. Never yield to force. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. End quote. She wouldn't know, but Churchill inspires me, not just because of his quotations, some of which thrill me to my bone. He inspires me because he took the most abuse while warning England for 8 solid years about Hitler's intention. I had to search high and low yesterday. It's really, William Manchester started out, it was intended to be a 3-volume set. I had to search high and low yesterday to find this book in my hand. The 2-volume set was actually at the very bottom of a pile in one of my cupboards. That's right. We still haven't fully unpacked from the loss of our home some 15 years ago, but I found the book. I had purchased it shortly after William Manchester published it in 1988. I was a young man then, 38 years old, and its lessons have stayed with me ever since. Let me give you a few gems from these pages. The book, The Last Lion by William Manchester. Okay? And it's I know I have 2 volumes. I think he died in the middle of the 3rd. You'll see where I'm going in a minute. On page 84, we find this. Political genius lies in seeing over the horizon, anticipating a future invisible to others. Churchill first warned of the approaching war in the Hearst papers on March 31st, 1931. That's 8 years before Germany invaded Poland and triggered the official start to World War II. Churchill stayed the course and faithfully warned England, though he was mercilessly treated for what some saw as his saber-rattling and warmongering. Yes, he was hopelessly misjudged during those years. Winston himself was described as a disappointed office seeker, the pursuer of a personal vendetta, who was trying to poison and vitiate the atmosphere. That's from page 100. Sort of reminds me of somebody I know. On the mission field, I'm seen as a pussycat, a sucker for sob stories, way too liberal with money, wanting to fix virtually every problem in the so-called ghettos. You know, I can remember once at a particular store in West Kingston, Denham Town, I lined up maybe a dozen children. It was a hot day and I got them something cool, or maybe box juices were in there. And my friend Philip Allen said to me, David, don't take out your wallet. What he was trying to tell me is that there are people down there watching you. You're a stranger to this community. Not do them thing make people see. But I had the whole group of children lined up. And I paid for the drinks. Maybe some juice in there. Maybe some Malta. Who knows? I don't remember. But on the mission field, the Bible says you mustn't say anything good about yourself. Let others say. But let me just say that I've earned a reputation of trying to touch every life that I can. I have friends down there who will call me from time to time about people in need, about people who are hungry. I got a call night before last. Somebody said, Pastor, that's what she called me, crying, I'm hungry. And I sent her a little something to assuage his hunger. As I've repeatedly said, my belly is hanging over my belt. I can't bear the thought of people hungry, you know. So on the mission field, and I get calls, several calls every day from Denham Town and elsewhere in Jamaica. On the mission field, I'm this pussycat, this nice guy. But in these videos that you've been watching, I've been called an angry man with a chip on his shoulder. You don't know the other side of David Mould. You only see me on these videos knocking out against Ted Wilson and the Great Hope. You don't know that other side. So let me tell you. This one just came in yesterday. Of course I'm angry. That's a person who said I'm an angry man with a chip on my shoulder. That's an email I got yesterday. He also said some rather derogatory things and I deleted it. I'm angry because of what I see happening inside God's church. Yes, I'm angry. I'm not angry on the mission field. Although, yes, I'm angry at Satan for what he has done to my home. But this is the church that introduced me to the great controversy. Why shouldn't I be angry over the trash that's being peddled in its place? Why shouldn't I be angry when Ted Wilson stands up with a bold-faced lie and speaks about distributing 140 million copies of the great controversy?
The Great Controversy is the book that Ellen White said several times that she wished to be distributed more than any of her other books. We praise God that during this past quinquennium, coordinated by the Publishing Ministries Department, 140 million copies of the Great Controversy in its various versions have been distributed in so many countries of the world.
If he includes one Great Hope in there, and as I said to you, the South American division, 80,000 copies of that book were distributed across South America. Not one Great Controversy in the last report I saw. It was Luther who wrote, I never work better than when I'm inspired by anger. When I'm angry, I can write, pray, and preach well, for then my whole temperament is quickened, my understanding sharpened, and all mundane vexations and temptations depart. But back to Churchill. Here is one of the insults offered to him during those lonely years when he was almost the only voice warning England of the coming war. This insult comes from Stanley Baldwin, who 3 times was voted Prime Minister of England. Here is what Baldwin thought of Churchill. That is, before Hitler invaded Poland, and before the unfolding war made him, Stanley Baldwin, look like a fool for being so wrong about Churchill. And it made Churchill so right. The things he had been saying for 8 years were now coming to pass. But here is the insult Stanley Baldwin offered. It's on page 155 of this book. One of these days, he said, I'll make a few casual remarks about Winston. I've got it all ready. I'm going to say that when Winston was born, lots of fairies swooped down on his cradle with gifts, imagination, eloquence, industry, ability. And then came a fairy who said, no one person has a right to so many gifts. Picked him up and gave him such a shake and twist that with all these gifts he was denied judgment and wisdom. And that is why we delight to listen to him in the House, meaning the House of Commons, but do not take his advice. End quote. That's the kind of stuff Churchill had to put up with. Or should I have said, up with which Churchill had to put. All through this period when he was living the life of what Manchester called a prophet in exile. Yes, he inspires me. Cigar smoking, liquor drinking Winston Churchill inspires me. God worked through him to save Britain. Just like he worked through Nebuchadnezzar. And don't tell me Nebuchadnezzar didn't drink liquor either. I'm not justifying the drinking of liquor, but I'm telling you I'm unashamed to tell you Winston Churchill is one of my heroes. Fortunately, Churchill was undaunted, or at least if he was hurting inside, the public rarely saw it. Always quick-witted, sometimes Churchill gave as much as he took. For example, when asked what should be done if Baldwin died in office, he replied, embalm, bury, and cremate. Take no chances. That's Winston Churchill on page 109 of this book. On page 203, we find this gem. William James once wrote that men of genius differ from ordinary men, not in any innate quality of the brain, but in the aims and purposes on which they concentrate, and in the degree of concentration which they manage to achieve. Napoleon, himself great, called it the mental power to concentrate on objectives for long periods without tiring. Churchill possessed it. His eyes were focused on Hitler to the exclusion of all else. While Britain slept, Winston Churchill was awake to the danger. On page 219, we find this one. Winston was guided by a built-in gyroscope which would carry him toward his objective through tumult, while the Prime Minister relied on a kind of sociological radar, signals from the voters to determine his course. I like that. A built-in gyroscope. In closing, I'd like to quote from pages 299 through 301. It's going to be a long quote, but I want you to get more of a feel of the man and what he endured. And to tell you why when the hate mail comes to our website or when the hate mail comes to YouTube, it doesn't I can't say it doesn't faze me. I'm a sensitive soul. But I look back on what men like Churchill endured, and it sustains me. Of course, I look at the Apostle Paul, and Jesus in John 15 said, if they have persecuted me, they will persecute you. Okay? But Churchill, my hero Churchill, what did he endure? We're going to take a peek here at the hurting Churchill. Page 299. He's in the House of Commons. He's giving a speech. And he says this. For 5 years I have talked to the House on these matters, not with very great success. I have watched this famous island descending incontinently, fecklessly, the stairway which leads to a dark gulf. It is a fine, broad stairway at the beginning, but after a bit the carpet ends. A little farther on there are only flagstones, and a little farther on still these break beneath your feet. Then, in measured tones, he said this. If mortal catastrophe should overtake the British nation and the British Empire, historians 1,000 years hence will still be baffled by the mystery of our affairs. They will never understand how it was that a victorious nation, with everything in hand, suffered themselves to be brought low and to cast away all that they had gained by measureless sacrifice and absolute victory, gone with the wind. Now the victors are the vanquished, and those who threw down their arms and sued for an armistice are striding on to world mastery. That is the position. That is a terrible transformation that has taken place. Now is the time at last to rouse the nation. We should lay aside every hindrance and endeavor by uniting the whole force and spirit of our people to raise again a great British nation standing up before all the world. For such a nation, rising in its ancient vigor, can even at this hour save civilization. Compare that to Ted Wilson, waltzing over into the promised land without reminding you that many of us are going to get slaughtered in the process. Manchester continued. As he took his seat, the house broke into a hubbub of noise. Members rattled their papers and shuffled their way to the lobby. Virginia Cowles was in the House lobby, awaiting a prominent Conservative MP who had invited her to tea. As he strode up, she asked him of his opinion of Winston's speech. He replied, "Oh, it was the usual Churchillian filibuster. He likes to rattle the saber, and he does it jolly well. But you always have to take it with a grain of salt." That's what the man had to endure. She recalled that was the general attitude of the House of Commons in those days. Even Churchill realized that Chamberlain, that's Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, even Churchill realized that Chamberlain's determination not to rouse the nation. You couldn't find a better metaphor to describe Ted Wilson and the General Conference. Determined not to rouse the Seventh-day Adventist Church, to prepare for war. Determined to preach platitudes. Determined to keep us asleep. Determined to keep us quiet while the Vatican is preparing her arms every day and every day getting stronger. That's an abdication of duty. That's why I wouldn't return tithe to this church. If you paid me $1 billion with a B, I wouldn't do it. They're determined to keep us sleeping. Even Churchill realized that Chamberlain's determination not to rouse the nation was echoing the mood of countrymen who did not want to be roused. Fleet Street, in step with its readers, ignored Churchill's speech and reported Chamberlain's. The liberal Manchester Guardian declared, "Mr. Chamberlain has overcome the enemies in his own camp." And in the New Statesman, John Maynard Keynes urged the Czechs to negotiate a settlement with Hitler. The Chamberlains and the Cadogans drove to Clevedon for a weekend party with, as Cadogan put it, an ordinary sort of crowd. The Prime Minister won the after-dinner game of musical cheers every time. Did you hear that? Isn't that what we're doing as a Seventh-day Adventist church? Musical cheers. While Hitler is preparing his war machine, Neville Chamberlain is playing musical cheers and winning every time. I don't know whether to laugh or to cry. That God's church should have called me from Caymanas Park, Jamaica, and educated me because I hated history. Put the Great Controversy in my hand, a book. I can't tell you how many times I've read it. I stopped counting at 30. And to see this church, which convinced me that it had the truth, and I still believe it has the truth, to see this church playing the fool, and to see us like a pack of idiots saying amen to Ted Wilson when he speaks about 140 million copies of the Great Controversy distributed, knowing that 80,000 of that 140 was the great hope. I don't know whether to laugh or to cry. I'm sorry. Musical cheers. That's what Neville Chamberlain was playing while Winston Churchill trying to rouse the nation. Tell me we're not playing musical cheers. The morning after his dire warning to the House, Churchill received an unexpected, dismaying, and most unwelcome letter from the editor of Beaverbrook's Evening Standard, terminating his contract. You hear that? Terminating his contract. In effect, firing him after giving that speech about the broad stairway that Britain was descending. Thus ended 2 years of fortnightly columns, depriving him of his most valuable public rostrum. Because, the editor wrote, it has been evident that your views on foreign affairs and the part this country should play are entirely opposed to those held by us. It was a setback. An annual loss of £1,820, about £9,000 at the then prevailing rate, $9,000, at the then prevailing rate of exchange. And the timing could scarcely have been worse. He was broke. He sat in his Chartwell study, staring at columns of figures which should have made him blush. A Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s, he had presided over England's fiscal affairs for nearly 5 years. Yet his personal finances were hopelessly muddled. Few writers could match his income. During the past 8 years, he had earned £102,000, £102,000, an annual average of £12,763, the equivalent of about $62,000. Chartwell, his London flat, and general expenses alone exceeded £10,000 each year, and his travels, secretaries, researchers, and the lavish luncheons and dinners he gave for colleagues and visitors from the continent drove him deeper and deeper into the red. The year before, he had faced his first real financial crisis. His letters to Clementine in the first weeks of 1937 are shadowed by a veiled and then explicit preoccupation with money, which was wholly out of character for Churchill. Small attempts at economizing while he spread himself elsewhere. The man God used to save Britain couldn't pay his bills. He had set up Randolph and Sarah in Westminster Garden Flats and had told Sarah, I will give her £200 towards expenses. But he added defensively, he was only fulfilling promises made long before. Fuel for Chartwell, delivered in 5-ton batches at £9.11 each, used to last a fortnight. He reminded her. But the last load kept them warm for 3 months, despite weather that was raw and generally damnable. In short, the man and his wife and his family were sleeping in cold. That's what Winston Churchill was going through while trying to rally his country for war. Moreover, he had lost only £12 at Bezique, he wrote, and the wine has been very strictly controlled and little drunk. He became temperate. Also, telephone bills showed a marked reduction. The man is trying to economize. We are having fortnightly accounts from the post office, which enables us to check it. Finally, he wrote on a note of triumph, I am not taking inches with me abroad. Clemmy knew that the little saved by leaving his valet behind would shrink to insignificance besides his Riviera expenses. And indeed, he glumly wrote on February 2nd that he had been talking to a Mr. Frank Capon, a real estate agent. Capon tells me, he wrote, that there is a lady nibbling around for a house like Chartwell, and even mentioning Chartwell. The agent said he would on no account mention any figure less than £30,000. If I could see 25,000, I should close with it. If we do not get a good price, we can carry on for a year or two more. But no good offer should be refused, having regard to the fact that our children are almost all flown, and my life is probably in its closing decade. How wrong he was about his life. I'm going to say something here. This is not part of the script. I remember when Joanne and I had 4 children, and we lost our first house. Might have been our second. No, first. I had a place which was on 10 acres, and I had friends living in it. I told them, just pay the land tax. I didn't want to make any money off of them. But when crunch time came, I had to move into that house. And I remember Joanne and my children sleeping on the floor for about a month. Because after about a month, the floor didn't feel so hard. Reading Churchill evokes a lot of memories about my own life and what we have gone through by the grace of God, hanging on when everybody thought the ministry was dead, to be around for this day, to stand up and to try to rally the Seventh-day Adventist Church to what is before our faces. Fortunately, Churchill didn't quit. As a grateful England would acknowledge to this day, with that type of inspiration behind me, how could anybody ask me why I continue along the vein that guides me? Why do I continue crying at the abomination and the folly and the absolute treason of replacing the great controversy with the great hope? Instead of praising Ted Wilson's mild admonition in San Antonio that we get ready for crossing the Jordan, why am I today reminding you and reminding the church about what Sister White calls the season of distress and anguish that is to precede the crossing of any Jordan? You'll find that little phrase on page 621 of the Great Controversy, by the way. If Churchill isn't a clear enough example for you, if you still find it hard to grasp what inspires me, what makes me tick as a Christian, then turn with me to the book of Jeremiah for our final verse this morning. Once you're reminded of these verses that I'm going to share with you, then I believe you'll see what I see and hear what I hear. It's Jeremiah chapter 4, verses 19 and 20. My bowels, I am pained at my very heart. My heart maketh a noise in me. I cannot hold my peace, because thou hast heard, O my soul, the sound of the trumpet. I've heard it, the alarm of war. Destruction upon destruction is cried, for the whole land is spoiled. Suddenly are my tents spoiled, and my curtains in a moment. Jeremiah 4, 19 and 20. Beloved, that's why I cannot be quiet. Jeremiah felt the pain right down to his bones, or as the King James puts it, his bowels. That's why I will bark till I drop. God's church, God's people need as many voices as God can muster to prepare them for the destruction that is to precede their march across Jordan and into the promised land. I'm happy to lend my voice to the cause. He who hath ears to hear, let him hear. Amen.